Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session 45, environmental policies. We have 4 speakers. We're still waiting for the other 2. And then the first speaker of the session is Rafael. He will talk about energy economy implications of the Glasgow pledges. And every speaker will get 20 minutes to speak, and then followed by 10-minute discussion. Then we have some transition time that can be used to adjust a longer or shorter presentation. I will suggest all the audience to hold their questions to the end or post it in the chat box during the presentation, so we can allow the speakers to finish their talk first, and then we'll have some discussions. Without further ado, so Rafael, do you mind make your screen like I cannot read your language, but it's like
it's in the
make
other
it a full screen. Yeah, we're now seeing double screen yet with the small window on the right. Yep.
Let me share it again. So we just tried, and then I probably shared the wrong one. 1 second, and now we are fine.
We still got time. Yeah. This one looks good. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's much better for me.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. This is a work conducted at the European Commission, the Joint Research Center in Seville, with several other colleagues, where we assess the energy economy implications of the recent Glasgow pledges of the COP26. So we perform a global stocktake of the COP26, but also looking at the regional level with some focus on the G20 countries. So I'm presenting, but several other colleagues are part of this work. A brief introduction, of course. These renewed country level climate policy commitments announced during the last COP are essentially a call for updated GHG emission pathways to assess, of course, our main question, which is to what extent the Paris Agreement target of limiting the global mean temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century are within reach. So we depart from this main question, but our assessment tries to cover other questions related to energy and economy implications. And our contribution is essentially threefold. Our contribution to the literature in general of long-term assessments. We project the change in the global average temperature based on a consistent integrated modeling that captures this energy transition, the mitigation options that to reach these temperature targets. We assess the gaps between current and announced policies at regional level, looking at implementation and ambition gaps. And we extend earlier work from my colleagues, Toon van Dijk and other colleagues, by including revised technology cost projections, the other considerations in terms of recently published data sets on energy jobs and so on. The structure of the presentation I'll go through this main introduction, a brief overview on the methods, where we link several models to provide this assessment, and then results and some conclusions, some main takeaways. Importantly, this work is derived from the Global Energy and Climate Outlook 2021, a report that we conduct every year, and we publish every year at the JSC. The report is available, and now we produced a more synthetic version discussing the literature and let's say the academic aspects of this work. So as I mentioned, we use several models for this multidimensional analysis. We depart from same framework conditions of the macroeconomic projections on population and GDP, including the impacts of short-term impacts of COVID and in these projections. These projections are fed into the, let me try to, sorry, are fed into the post GSE model, which is a global bottom-up energy system model that projects year by year in a recursive approach. That projects the energy and emission balances year by year up to 100, with regional detail covering around 66 countries and regions, including this explicit representation of the OECD and G20 countries, as I mentioned. In the next step, the outcomes of the energy modeling go into our economic modeling, let's say, where we have this tool called Pyramid, which essentially translates the inputs from polls into the IO format base that we rely on, which is the GTAP database, 10 database. And after projecting these IO tables in time and building a consistent baseline with the energy system model, we are able to assess the policy impacts and policy scenarios that we want to assess in this exercise. So it's essentially it facilitates a lot the work of the modeler in terms of having a consistent baseline and using it in the policy assessments. And finally, these also the outcomes from polls are used as an input in the Live Magic model to assess the climate response in terms of temperature change. Also considering the land use and agriculture emissions from the GloBiome that are taken into account in the polls model. So this is more, this is the whole framework. As I mentioned, several people working on different areas here. I will now jump into our main results. So looking at, first looking at emissions and temperature change, we see here on the left global GHG emissions in gigaton CO2 equivalent over 2100. And we see the pink line, which is the current policy scenario, is only sufficient to stabilize emissions after 2040 at a level of around 60 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, which implies an increase in temperature by the end of the century of more than 3 degrees Celsius. So far enough from our Paris Agreement goals, but then relying on the nationally determined contributions and our NDCs, and further relying on long-term strategies to achieve net zero by mid-century, as announced by many countries. We see that a bend in this curve occurs around already into 2030. Reaching around 47 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, and further with a sizable decrease over mid-century due to the long-term strategies of, especially because of the long-term strategies of the G20 countries. This is enough, of course, to stabilize emissions around 13, 14 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by the end of the century, implying a temperature increase of 1.8 degrees Celsius, which is in line with the SSP1 RCP 2.6 scenarios of the recent IPCC report, assessment report number 6, which is, of course, which is a very ambitious goal, as we can see when we take into account the sizable implementation gap that we observe between current policies and announced policies. We also see that apart from this implementation gap, we also see a persistent ambition gap throughout the time horizon here, meaning that the 1.5 degree ambition is still challenge. Is still a challenge to be achieved. Where we observe this. We also observe that the NDC, we also simulate an NDC only scenario where we freeze the carbon prices after 2030, which leads to 2.6 degrees Celsius and increase in temperature. So when we zoom in into a country level figure, and here we see that different countries ranked by the share of the global GHG emissions in 2019, and in the bars here we see levelized emissions in the current policy scenarios in 2030 and 2050, decompose across the implementation gap, the ambition gap, and remaining emissions. And we observe, first, they need for immediate adoption of policies to achieve these LTS targets, as we observe that over 2030 to 2050, this implementation gap considerably increased across countries. So this dark part of the dark blue bar part of the bar. On the other hand, the announced net zero targets get the world, as we saw in the previous figure, closer to the 1.5 pathway, and we observe that the ambition gap is reduced over this time horizon across countries, but much lower emissions are needed to reach the 1.5 degree target. And the main reason, main driver of this transformation relies on the energy transition in terms of transformation of reducing GHG emissions. We see that in this graphs here, the primary energy demand in the three different scenarios: our current policy scenario, and the NDC long-term strategy scenario, and the 1.5 scenario, 1.5 degree scenario. First, we note that energy efficiency plays an important role in reducing the overall primary energy demand in these scenarios over time. But we also note that the main contributor to this reduction is the phase out of coal, not only in the primary energy, but we also observe in the power generation here, where in the more ambitious scenario, we almost observe a complete phase out of coal in the power generation, which is of course compensated by the increase of renewable power generation, especially by wind and solar in both scenarios. I also note an important point that even in the 1.5 scenarios, we see a decrease in natural gas consumption and power generation. So this transformation of the power generation and the energy system in general is really important, but alone it's not sufficient to achieve the 1.5 degree targets, and other sectors are also relevant and contribute, especially if we take into account the regional dimension. So we see here in this graph the share of abatement in total abatement of these different regions in the world, and we in the y-axis we have the share of power generation contributing the most in regions like China and India, where in the x-axis we have the agriculture, forestry, and land use emissions, and the share of these emissions contributing the most in regions, of course, like Latin America and Africa. Over time, we see here the empty bubbles representing 2050, and the filled bubbles, circles, representing 2030. The size of the circles represents the total mitigation, and we see the world moving, increasing the increasing mitigation in global mitigation, especially because we observe China and India contributing the contribution of power generation, or decarbonization of the power generation in these regions, where we see the global mitigation achieving around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by towards mid-century. So now moving into economic considerations or economic outputs of this transformation. What are the implications for the economic system and for the sectors? So let's have a look a bit into the more detailed information of sectors. We're looking at sector-specific output and investment in 2040 in this table. So here the two different scenarios and the changes relatively to the current policy scenario. Where we highlighted here, we observe the strong decrease in the output level of fossil fuel energy related sectors, especially in coal, as I mentioned before. Also, with strong correlation, of course, with the level of investment. On the other hand, we note that the electricity sector goes in the opposite direction. So a greater electrification of the global economy in general is observed, especially going to renewables, but also helping to promote growth in other sectors like the construction sector, where we see here. And also fostering the decarbonization of final uses in many other applications. We don't see it here, but I forgot to mention that in the previous figure we observed just a part of the total abatement. So other sectors like transports, electrification in the transport sector and the building sector are also responsible to reduce total emissions. We observe also biomass production expanding, and which promotes the growth in the output level of agriculture and forestry in both scenarios here. Also, due to bio-CCS use in more ambitious scenarios, but also due to biofuels production. And finally, I would like to highlight that this first line here shows the costs in terms of GDP loss compared to the current policy scenario, less than 0.5% of the global GDP, meaning that in the current policy scenario we grow like on average 2.74%, and in these scenarios we are around 2.7% in terms of growth of global GDP. Another important consideration that we assess in our study is the transition of jobs by sector. So we observe that a global transition of jobs from fossil fuel sectors to low carbon oriented sectors. In this figure here, we see that the height of the bars represents the employment levels in the current policy scenario in 2050. And the horizontal axis shows the change, the relative change from the current policy scenarios in 2050, represented in the bars. And the dots here are only here. We try to illustrate the difference in 2030. So we don't see a big difference occurring in 2030, whereas in 2050 the bars represent the total change in the different scenarios. So the light colors represent the 1.5 scenario, and the dark colors the CLPS scenario. So the first observation, of course, is that fossil fuel sectors, although they lose a lot in terms of relative change, they contribute. They're not the most. They're not the sector that the most contributes to the total employment. And this is somehow offset by the increase in renewables, also in biomass, due to biomass production and biofuels, which we see here, these sectors leading to increased opportunities in these sectors. A final observation, we know that the market services and non-market services appear here as reducing the number of jobs relatively to the current policy scenarios. However, I note that this is a slight difference, and when we take into account that these sectors are growing, we observe that in the current policies, the number of jobs grows in the service sectors, but also grows in the NDC and 1.5 scenario, but grows less than current policy scenario. So moving to my final slides, some conclusions, some takeaway messages of these long-term assessments. We assessed current policies that lead to a temperature increase of about 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, as compared to pre-industrial levels, while delivering on the NDCs and the net zero pledges brings the world towards the Paris Agreement target to a 1.8 degrees Celsius increase in the temperature, which is not enough. We see that the ambition gap to 1.5 degree remains, both in the short and the long term. I highlighted the strong decarbonization of the power sector that further enables mitigation through greater electrification of other energy uses. And we note in the previous slide that the increasing renewable energy jobs offsets the job losses in fossil fuel sectors, which is in line with recent studies in the literature, like Pai and Hall and other more regional studies that also achieve the same conclusion. I invite you to look at our report, which is available at this website. We have a preprint of the paper in the GTAP resources, and hoping that it will be published soon. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and pass the floor to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. That was a very great, very good presentation. A lot of information and very good. So the audience, do you have any questions you want to interact with Rafael? Yeah, go ahead, please, William.
Yeah, so very interesting. Thank you. I had looked at the Gecko report. I call it the Gecko report. I don't know if that's the the standard way of shortening it, but I'd never see in detail how it works. So that's very nice. I was a bit curious about the connection with Globiome. So I was just wondering how the also I do like this idea of looking at the employment and how that shifts a bit to agriculture and things like that. Is it from the Globiome that you just get the land use and the I was wondering how if there's a connection there, or can you explain perhaps how the Globiome figures also into the GDP projections and things like that? I'm curious about that.
Thanks, William. Very good question. And indeed, it's Gecko. We call Gecko. That's true. So that's an excellent point, because if I may maybe share the screen again so we can see the connections, maybe that would be helpful, I think. Coming back to the, if I may. So we essentially take Globiome as an exogenous input to the Pole's energy system modeling. So we take into account the land use and agricultural emissions from them to calibrate the model and then project these emissions, of course, according to the drivers of endogenous drivers of Poles. But then, as a limitation of our analysis, and your question is quite timely in that sense, in our JRC geometry model, where we assess the employment transition, as I showed before, we don't take into account the emissions from land use and agriculture there, meaning that we are only looking essentially at CO2 energy emissions, but these emissions are taken exogenous here at the post GRC. So in the employment transition analysis, we are relying only in the CO2 part, let's say, and then not in the information, the full information taken to from the Globiome in the geometry model. So this information goes into Poles. We process, we take the energy balances and the emission balances, then we calibrate here. But here we don't have the land use emissions being modeled in the CG model, if that's a question. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So you don't have like a dynamic connection with the land use and those emissions. It's but you will then include the employment bits that are connected, so to say. But that's
exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is a very good point, because we're looking into constantly update the energy intensities and our emissions intensities in different sectors. We made it a great update based on the Pi et al. Publication of the energy data set, on the energy jobs data set, where they looked at the global level of different emissions intensities and energy of the job intensity, the job intensities of the energy sectors. And we included that. In the further steps, we are looking into more refinements of specific sector job intensities as well.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of data. Yeah.
All right. Interesting. Yeah.
I just have a following question about the linkage between the models. Looks like there's no feedback to global biome. You said you only took the output from it as some input in the energy section. Is it because the complexity of the modeling coupling doesn't allow you to do some full coupling of the two systems?
Yeah, excellent question. Thanks. So one reason, of course, relies on complexity. But what another reason is that for the coupling, what we essentially do is fix the energy system information as a Leontief structure in our CG. So we take, as I mentioned before, we take the quantities from the energy balances from the different technologies of the pole system, and we sort of introduce them in the IO database. So there we start constructing let's say a consistent baseline, because both models rely, of course, on the same drivers as in terms of projection. So we are looking forward to have a feedback loop, which I think will increase much more the consistency. But this has not been done so far. And we're looking forward to it. But once we project the baseline, considering the IO structure, I think we are, for a first step, we are kind of very consistent in taking this information. And I think the main point, as you mentioned, is the complexity of coming and going, because many different researchers working in different models. So the sort of exchanging information is not always trivial.
Yeah.
Especially when we are challenged, we're constrained by time to publish and get the reports finished. But we are looking forward to it. It's in our plans, definitely.
Good.
Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Good. Any questions from the audience? If not, probably. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a very, very short one.
Yeah.
Just because I was curious about the regions that you include, because I don't remember it. You talk about the G20, but then is the whole setup, is it global, and what's the resolution of the rest of the models, let's say?
Yeah, good point. Thanks, William. I probably, in the report we probably have the full list, but we have 66 regions, country and regions, of course. I only show the G20, but we modeled from the 66. I think we covered all countries that updated their NDCs.
Okay, so that's
and announced LTS. Of course, there's some regional aggregation, small countries, small islands, and so on. but the most relevant that are not showed in the analysis include like Pakistan and other many relevant countries in terms of emissions. So yes, but if you need a complete list, of course,
I can probably find it. I was just curious, but in principle, the fact that they have these NDCs updated or published, that's what guides the level of detail that you then put into this effort, so to say.
Exactly. And it was last minute updates because at the very last point, countries were announcing pledges.
Sounds like fun work.
Cool.
All right, cool.
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks to you.
And Rafael, can you also discuss briefly about how to capture the uncertainty in the system?
So we don't do a sensitivity analysis at the points. We capture more or less the uncertainty when we look at the climate impacts in terms of temperature change. There we perform several, let's say, sensitivities, but within the CGE, not much, except for price changes in one or two scenarios. In terms of uncertainty, we rely on a more deterministic approach. We don't capture the different probabilities in the CG model, right? Whereas when we move to the climate dimension and decreasing the different temperature, there we get more the probabilistic dimension, and there we can see more or less uncertainty. Of course, I mentioned the 1.8, but that includes the range, which is quite similar to the IPCC. If you remember, where our median projection is more or less similar to the SSP1, RCP 2.6 from the IPCC in terms of temperature change. In terms of the energy system modeling, these uncertainties rely much more on the technology cost projection. So of course there is great uncertainty there, but again, it's essentially what we get from the data sets, from the literature. So we end up relying on a more deterministic approach in that sense, except for the final part that I mentioned on the temperature. Yeah. Thanks for your question. I hope it clarifies a bit.
Yeah. Have you ever seen or done anything on the CG model parameters? So have you found any parameter that could be kind of navigating the outcomes?
There is. We have looked at in elasticities, but in the model, of course, is somehow sensible to changes in that. For the energy system, given that we take as a Leontief approach, there's no much to do there. We rely essentially on the information coming from the energy system modeling. So in that sense, we don't perform let's say a backcast analysis on taking into account if different values of elasticities would imply, but we rely pretty much on the literature of elasticity and taking into account elasticity from the GTAP database and so on. Sure. And given that it's a long-term assessment, of course, when you look at that, we try to calibrate the specific sectors more into this long-term direction according to different elasticities in the model. I think we have information there available as well in the web page that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And if I may add also a final point, we try to be really transparent in terms of providing, of course, the full energy balances, the macroeconomic balances, the IO tables there. So if you look at the web page, we try to share the most in terms of information and outcomes there. Yeah, I think that's it. It's challenging, of course, to get all the business entities to tackle this, but we acknowledge that.
Yeah, these are all hard questions.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Okay,
Thanks
thank you. Your excellent presentation. And let's move to our second speaker of the session, Kitetu. Glad you show up. So Kitetu will present United States re-entered the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. There are some unexpected twists and opportunity costs. So it's very intriguing title. So we look forward to hearing about the presentation.
Can you allow me to share my file?
I think you can share. You can't because
to...
everybody could. We tested before the session started.
Sorry, I was trying to find. Clicking the button is not working. So wait.
What is the problem?
I'm trying to click to share, but it's not. The button is not working.
Okay. Do you mind email me your slides so I can share from my end? Then while we're working on that, probably we can let William go first. William, are you there?
Okay, sure.
Oh yeah, we can see a screen now.
Okay, let me see whether I can share.
You only need to sorry for the tech.
Okay, then I'm
Which
trying. Let me share the screen. I'm trying. It's not working.
do you have a copy of your slides
Yes, I have.
uploaded to the website? So I can download
Yes,
from
but
there.
yes, it's uploaded.
Okay. Okay, I will try to download it from my end and then share from my side. See if you have if we upload it as the
Share from
Okay, is that yours?
Yes, that's mine. Even though what I have is improved, but I can present from there. From that one.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. This is probably the best I can do. Can everybody see it?
It's too small.
Okay, cool. You can start then, Kitetu.
For me, it's too small. I don't know. Can you enlarge it a bit?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, allow me to thank you so much, and sorry for that inconvenience. My name is Kitetu Geoffrey, and my co-presenter is Ko Jong-un. I would also like to thank the GTAP Center for the help and for allowing us to be able to present our research. This is our preliminary research, so we are still working on using different tools of analysis to make it big. So the title of our presentation is United States Reenters the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, the unexpected threats and the opportunity costs SCG approach. In terms of, you remember immediately during the American political season, former President Donald Trump promised to reverse the treaties on climate change that was signed before or during the Obama era. So in 2017, then can you move the screen a little bit? So in terms of the contents, I'll try to give an introduction and then a background. I will try to skip some slides on the background, and then I will talk about the model design, and then I will briefly give a description of the simulation results and conclude the remarks, and finally I'll try to give the limitations of our model and possible further research studies. Next. Because of the dynamic nature of climate change based on CO2 emissions, and then the debate about climate change still remains a topic to be discussed. And the most important thing is the contribution of human beings in terms of CO2 emissions, which leads to the global warming. As I said, this is a preliminary study, and we are going to use a static GTAP model to evaluate the possible impact of CO2 emissions by the USA and as well as other countries. And we'll also be looking at the opportunity cost the USA will be able to pay for implementing the CO2 emission reduction targets upon the re-entry into the Paris Climate Accord. Next. According to, based on the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, parties agreed to reduce or to limit global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial periods. And this is to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change. In order to avoid this, the impact of climate change, the global CO2 emissions have to decline by 45% from the 2010 CO2 emission levels, and that is by 2030, and reach net zero by 2050. Next. Because of concerted efforts by many stakeholders in the world, then which culminated into the COP's 26 conference, which was held in Glasgow, UK. A lot of efforts and achievements were made, and a variety of measures were discussed and agreed upon. And these included issues to do with mitigation, adaptation, finance, and the collaboration with the aim of limiting the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This, to be just brief, the COP26 conference came up with the COP26 Pact, which secured a near global net zero greenhouse gas emissions, whereby about 153 countries submitted new NDCs. Out of the 156 countries, they accounted for about 90% of the total world GDP. Okay, next. One of the things that I just would like to mention here is the agreement to enhance the transparency framework, especially in terms of reporting of the emissions, because when you try to analyze the NDC, sometimes there is a lot of discrepancy in terms of reporting. So to try to deduct some information from some of the NDCs which have been submitted, sometimes it's not possible to find out exactly what the countries are committing to. So during the COP26 conference, they were able to streamline the Paris rulebook, which agreed to address some of those issues. And another thing is the agreement on streamlining the mechanisms and standards for international carbon markets. Even though to some extent the trade in CO2 emissions has not been understood by many people. I mean the concept. Next. Next. Sorry for the inconvenience. I should have the control. Okay, this is just a continuation of the background study, but I would like to summarize. During, I think there's a slide which was missing, but the slide shows that the United States was able to submit the new NDCs in April 22nd of 2021, and a long-term low greenhouse gas development strategy on November 1st, 2021. And before that, in 2021, immediately after the United States President Biden came into power, he reversed the order by the former president and started a new journey to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Originally, there are studies which were trying to analyze the potential impact of the withdrawal of US into the Paris Climate Agreement. And one study by Boriga and Rutherford was trying to find out the potential impact of the potential for retaliatory effects by other countries, which might impose taxes on US imports. And he found that if that was the case, then the USA might suffer much rather than implement the Paris Climate Agreement. The point is, in case the cost of implementing the Paris Climate Agreement would be much lower than the retaliatory effects in case other countries like China were to impose the retaliatory approach by imposing taxes on US exports. Next. So in this context, then our study aims to empirically examine the potential economy-wide effects of reducing CO2 emissions by 2030 according to the nationally determined commitments by the parties to the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as try to find out the opportunity cost the USA is likely to pay for implementing nationally determined CO2 emission targets. And this will utilize, as I said, the static GTAP model, which is a multi-region, multi-sector, computable general equilibrium. Another unmentioned objective is we were also trying to see if the low CO2 emitters contribute they have any significant contribution to the global climate change. And this I'll explain when it comes to data and aggregation. Next. So I'll just try, there is one slide above. Okay, thank you. So in terms of the methodology, we'll utilize the GTAP model, and because this is the information is public, I will not be able to stress much. And what I can just add in terms of this one, I can say that the GTAP CG model analyzes the economy as a whole and follows the Leon Wallace general equilibrium theory, which shows that all economies can attain equilibrium where demand and supply for commodities equilibrate. And there is no specific definition of CG models, but you can say that CG models include simultaneous equations, and the simultaneous equations, of course, they are guided by theory, and they try to explain or describe the constraint optimizing behaviors of all economic engines. And these engines include savers, investors, producers, exporters, and consumers and governments. So I just got one reference there for code 1993. So in line with just for a description of the model, we can be able to describe the model using the nested production structure, which is the GTAP model is just the GTAP model production structure is just a nested, is an extension of the standard GTAP model, and it contains about 8 nested production levels. At each level we have an output. So I will, because of time, I would like to just skip this one if need be. So just data will be enough. So for the purpose of data, we utilized GTAP database version 10, which has data on 141 regions and in 65 sectors. And for convenience sake, we mapped all the 141 sectors into 18 regions, including the US, which is our main focus, and 14 sectors, which include the 5 energy sectors: coal, oil, gas, oil, petroleum products, and electricity. Regarding scenarios, then we have 2 main scenarios, which are broken into several. We have 2 main experiments broken into several scenarios, and we have the baseline scenario, which is based on the business as usual, and the policy scenarios, which in which we try to reduce the greenhouse, the carbon CO2 emissions, CO2 emission quotas. Further description will be given in preceding slides. Next. This is
you have about 5 minutes.
It shows the regional and the sectoral aggregation, whereby we have 18 sectors and 14. We have 18 regions and 14 sectors. So, in terms of the regions, I try to group the major CO2 emitters. So we have the worldwide emission block and another region based on the major CO2 emitting countries, which include Korea, Japan, China, USA, UK, and the EU 27. In terms of sectors, we have the 5 main energy components: coal, oil, gas, and oil products, including the electricity. But because we know that there are sectors which consume energy, then in our analysis, we will be able to review the effects or the impact of the CO2 emission reduction to those sectors, either in terms of domestic production or in terms of other factors such as GDP and welfare. Next, thank you.
Kitetu, you have about 4 minutes, so you probably need to discuss your results.
Yeah, and this is policy scenarios. These are policy scenarios. So we have 8 policy scenarios, but our focus is based on scenario 3 and 4 for convenience of presentation. The other scenarios are just reference scenarios. So the first scenario 1 and 2 is about CO2 emission reduction without trading. Scenario 3 and 4 is about worldwide emission reduction with the trading. So between scenario 1, we exclude the USA. Scenario 2, we include the USA. So the difference, we use it to analyze we can use it to analyze the contribution of USA into climate change, or the opportunity cost the USA will be able to pay for implementing the CO2 emission reductions. Likewise, for scenario 3 and 4, in scenario 3, we exclude the US, and in scenario 4, we include the US. So we have a variety of frameworks upon which we can be able to do comparative analysis. But for convenience of this presentation, then I just select the worldwide emission reduction with the trading. So we also have the countries not highlighted. They are not part of the major emission trading blocks. So I will try using their outcome, we can be able to see whether the low emitting countries, they contribute any significant contribution to the climate change which is a main concern. So thank you. Next. There is something that we skipped, but there's something that but I can continue from there. Sorry for that.
This is okay.
So these are the simulation results, and we focus on just a few components. So we focus on the impact of CO2 reduction on real GDP, the impact of CO2 reduction on welfare, and the impact of CO2 on domestic production. Other results, I just did not include them in our slide, especially to do with the changes in exports and changes in imports. So slide table 4 shows the impact of CO2 emission reduction on real GDP. So first of all, since our focus is not only the USA, we can be able to explain about the effects on other countries, which is a spillover effect, considering that the USA is the economic size is big, and therefore the effect of USA on climate change based on their CO2 emissions is significant. And given that CO2 reduction involves structural changes within the economy, then we do expect that the effect, the inclusion or the implementation of CO2 reduction by USA will have some significant effects on other countries. So the effect is not uniform, is heterogeneous, and not only in terms of regions, but sector-wise, it's not uniform. So in this regard, based on real GDP, then I can use my printed copy because it is too small to see. So in terms of real GDP, then we find that if you try and look at the scenario 1 for reference purpose, GDP growth for the USA is positive. In this scenario is a CO2 emission reduction without the USA and without trading. However, as you try to move forward to scenario 2, you see the with the CO2 emission reduction, but including the USA, then the impact is very significant. But again, if you apply the CO2 emission reduction with the trading, then you can see the impact, the impact of CO2 emission reduction goes down, even though it's negative, but it's lower than under scenario 2, whereby you do CO2 emission reduction without trading. And if you look at the other countries, Korea, Japan, China, UK, and the EU, then you can see that there is, even though there is emission trading, the effect of CO2 reduction by USA is leads to an decline in the real GDP of those countries. One thing may be because of their major trading partners, and any structural changes within a country will affect the trade between the country and their other partners.
I'm sorry, Kitetu, I have to interrupt you. You are already over time, so can you hear me?
Yes.
You are already over time, so if you can quickly wrap up so we can still have time without other presenters and the discussion, okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So can you take me just to the...
You have more results and including remarks.
Yeah, just on the domestic output. Okay, just here.
Domestic output. I don't know.
Sorry, I should be...
Is this domestic output?
Yeah, this impact on domestic production by sector. Based, just to provide a summary of the outcome, I not just be specific in this case. Comparing with the scenario 3, whereby we exclude the USA, comparing scenario 3 and scenario 4, scenario 4 includes US. So in that case, you find that the impact on CO2 reduction for all the major energy commodities is significantly and negatively affected for the USA. So this may also account for the reason as to why the GDP, real GDP, is significantly affected for the USA when USA tries to implement its nationally determined commitments. So in terms of the impact on production of the low CO2 emitting countries, the effect is both positive and negative, unlike the impact on on welfare and GDP, but the negative effect is not very significant. Next, just the conclusion. So in terms of welfare laws for developed countries, we utilize the welfare and decomposition component to find out why the countries experienced a loss in terms of welfare. So for the developed countries, we found that the region's welfare loss emanated from CO2 trade imbalance, structural inefficiencies, and loss in investment. While for the less developed countries, their welfare loss emanated from unfavorable terms of trade and loss of investments. So just to the last slide so that I can conclude, so that we don't mix up. Oh, yeah,
is that your last?
Yeah, back.
Oh, I'm sorry. You put more slides
Stop.
here.
Stop.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. So I said this is a preliminary analysis. So because the impact of climate change takes significant time, so we would like to extend the model to by utilizing the dynamic approach, so that we can be able to account for the changes over time. And another thing that we'll be working on is we will also try to utilize the flexibility mechanisms to see the potential for utilizing taxes as mitigating factors or tools of analysis. So as I'm really sorry that my computer did not work. I should be controlling everything. So thank you so much for allowing me to share this small study. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kitetu.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have any questions for Kitetu? Let's see, because we're over time right now, so we can have probably one brief question, then move on to the rest of the schedule. See, yeah, looks like you did a great job. So it's people, it's already very clear. And without further ado, let's move to our third speaker, William.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's see if I have managed to set up my computer correctly.
Hopefully.
Oh, I'm already almost doing the wrong one. I hope you can all see this.
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah, all right. Well, thanks for coming all. And of course, it's an honor to be here as well at the GTAP conference, my first GTAP conference. Perhaps the next one, I'll meet some people in real life, but let's hope that next year will go better. This talk is titled The Future of the European Union Agriculture in the Global Context, which is a little grandiose perhaps, but we'll see how interesting it is for you all. This was actually, you'll see a couple of Dutch words throughout this presentation, because this was actually a study that was commissioned by the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, and this Dutch report has already been published, but that focused a little bit on the Dutch context. So now I'm actually in the process of parsing the results. So in principle, I have all the results, but I'm parsing still the results a bit for a more EU-focused study based on the same things that we did for that report. So a couple of the graphs will still be from my Dutch report, and I'm currently like massaging it over into an more EU-based and of course in the English language. So apologies beforehand, I'll translate where I can. So just the background of this study is in principle that the LNV, which is the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, has done this in the past. They asked our institute to do like analysis of the future of the Dutch agriculture through this kind of macroeconomic studies, and then put them in the context of what's happening in the world, and of course what's happening with sustainability ideas and things like that. Part of this current study was also to look at, okay, what's happening with all these Green Deal kind of things, and well, now the past week was an interesting one for the Green Deal, so we'll see how it all pans out. But you'll see some topics pop back into our scenario setup that we have for this study. And the global idea is to see, well, okay, what are the overall consequences of a couple of driving forces, like, you know, sustainability goals and goals of reducing CO2 emissions and things like that. And what will that do for the future of the European Union agriculture and horticulture, perhaps specifically mentioned, because that's for the Dutch sector, of course, quite important. And we focus here on like two axes of around trade and environment, and I'll go a little bit into more detail. And then basically we just look at the consequences of some scenario thinking towards like production volume, value added, the overall GDP impact, and also look at how the trade and also especially CO2 emissions will change due to different measures. For this, we apply the magnet model, which is, well, perhaps some of you know this here, but it is based, the core is a GTAP, implementation. Basically, we add a whole bunch of bells and whistles that are specifically focused towards the agricultural sectors. And specifically, one of the things, for example, is that we add an endogenous land supply, like so we can restrict the land supply, and then if you restrict the land supply, for example, to protect some biodiversity ideas, then that increases prices and all these kind of things. And we have a little bit more detail in the model, for example, when it comes to the fruit and vegetable sectors. So we have a couple of agriculture sectors split up a little bit more. So I presume if anybody has questions about the magnet model, I can answer them later, but I presume that I don't need to go into too much detail. So what I did want to show is of course, with magnet as with GTAP, you can flexibly set up the regional structure. So this model that we used for this study was 18 regions, and you'll see here that the Netherlands is one single region, and this was actually one of the few times with the latest magnet and GTAP data that we actually focused on the Netherlands itself. So, and this always reminds you of the more you zoom into these kind of databases, the more trouble you get. So I won't spend too much time on the things that happened in the Netherlands specifically, but it's always a challenge to look at single countries. For the rest, we have the East and the West EU, so these are really the European Union blocks, and then the rest of Europe, of course. And we added some important agricultural trading partners as well. Okay, so the basic setup of this study is scenario thinking, and this was also a little bit to get some of these ideas towards the Ministry of Agriculture. Okay, just see what they find interesting and what they find useful to think about. And it's not meant to predict the future in a very exact way, but to kind of get like two main ideas in there and see how they balance and see how they influence potential future. So our reference scenario is in principle just the standard SSP2. As we know, we don't really looked at a specific RCP, so we didn't really look at specific climate targets or things like that. So it's really a business as usual SSP2, and then just see what rolls out emissions wise and things like that. This is in principle a fairly pessimistic scenario, because you just see that meat consumption increases, all the production increases, emissions increases. So it's the reference scenario is a little bit of the bad business as usual, so to say. Then we presume two core axes on which we look at what's going to happen towards the future. And in all of these scenarios is in principle there's some sort of sustainability, some sort of greening, some sort of improvement in that area happening, and I'll go into details in the next slide what happens there. But the main insight that we try to get is, okay, what happens if the EU does all these things on its own? So what if we implement CO2 taxes? What if we, and with we, I mean then the EU, does when it comes to diet change to reduce meat consumption? And what happens if the whole world joins in that effort? And that's what the exercise there was, to just see what are those two extremes, so to say. And combined with that is the idea, okay, what happens with trade? Will we, and this will of course be an interesting juxtaposition with this. So, okay, if you do worldwide greening, does it matter if you then reduce trade barriers, or does it matter if you then protect your own market, so to say, things like that. So I'll go into detail into the scenario setup, but this is like the core, two dimensions that we're looking at simultaneously. And then every scenario is in principle a sustainability scenario, but it depends on whether it's just the EU. So just the EU doing everything on its own and reducing trade. Then is it just the EU, but then with less trade barriers? Is it the whole world agrees, but nobody wants to trade with each other? Or is it a green world open, so to say, with reduced trade barriers? All these scenarios run till 2050, just to put that in before I forget to mention that. And then a little bit more detail about this scenario setup. So these are the 4 scenarios that I just mentioned. And there's this trade axis, and the one, well, this is the easiest one to explain actually. So in the open scenarios, we basically reduce all the trade tariffs and trade barriers to, I think, to almost nothing, so to say, by 2050. So it's a slow decrease in all the tariffs that are in the model by design from the GTAP database, and then we just reduce all these barriers. In this, and I'll explain this one first, we have in these closed scenarios, we've implemented a trade preference shifters, not really trade preference shifters, but more consumers within these scenarios tend to shift their preference to buying only EU products. And in this, the worldwide variety, then every region has a preference shifter towards buying more within their region. So then China buys more within China, and the USA buys more within the USA. And this is kind of like a preference shifter. So it doesn't, in principle, shouldn't affect the total amount that consumers then buy, but it shifts the preference of where they buy it from. And this is a model trick that we do. Then the last trade thing that we implemented is, and I call this CBAM-ish. So this is the idea that, well, if we have sustainability measures in the EU, so for example, the CO2 tax is an important one, then we've calculated the change in the tariffs that the EU would need to do against imported goods to maintain the price level for the producers. So it's a little bit what this carbon border adjustment mechanism does, but we also include it on all the agriculture sectors and things like that. So this in principle protects the EU market from its own CO2 tax implementation. So that will switch me to the what we've dubbed here the greening or the sustainability kind of policies that we implemented in the model. Is basically CO2 tax, but in our case, our CO2 tax, and we up this by to $205 per ton by 2050. I have to remember, I think we took that from the GECO report. I'm not entirely sure, but this can of course be a lot of different numbers, but this is what we opted for. But in our model, we implemented on all the greenhouse gases and also in the agriculture sector. So what we have, for example, in the livestock sector, there's methane emissions, and then this CO2 tax also works on that methane emissions from the cows. But we also have mechanisms that through which then the farmers can decrease their emission intensity through the marginal abatement cost curves that were implemented in previous projects within Magnet. So in principle, there are ways for these sectors to reduce their emissions as well, as long as the price is high enough. So, and as you will perhaps understand now, we have the EU versions and the world versions. So in the EU versions, we only implement the CO2 tax for the EU, and for the world scenarios, we implement it worldwide. And that's also worldwide the same number everywhere. Then we have the food waste reduction policy, and this stems a little bit from if anybody has ever read some papers of from our side on the SSP1 implementation. So basically the sustainability scenarios towards the future. Then this 33% meat reduction or 33% food waste reduction is a common one to just say, okay, we assume that there's policies that are getting in place which will reduce the food waste, and this is of course one of the in principle low-hanging fruits, but difficult to realize. Furthermore, we have a reduction of meat consumptions, and this is reduction of meat consumption compared to this reference scenario that I talked about. So this is basically first calculating the baseline and then see, okay, what is the meat consumption there? And then we chop off 30%. And we do this except for the developing countries. So this is also because in these regions, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, the meat consumption is already quite low, so we decided not to do that there because it also has some negative effects on food availability if you do that too enthusiastic in regions where it's already a bit low. Finally, we have what I've dubbed here the biodiversity, and that's in principle extra protection of land use. We did this. I don't know why it says only for the EU. I think that's not true. So we have in the Magna model, we have sort of a default setup for the SSP1, where in collaboration with people from the image model, they calculated how much agricultural land you have to give up in order to protect the 30% of the terrestrial biomes. So and that's an additional implementation. So that's where we reduce the land supply to simulate the idea of protecting extra biodiversity. All right, so that's the general setup. So just a quick reminder that we have these 4 axes, and so every time I'll now show some results, and every time it's these 4 scenarios that basically have the interplay of all these different things included. I already see I hear of core results for Dutch agriculture, but I assure you that these figures are for the products for the European Union. And I still see some Dutch words. My apologies for that. These were some of the core results that we collected from this exercise. And just to show the first thing to explain how this graph works a little bit, we have the production volume in the EU, and then we mostly look at the primary crops and the primary livestock sector. And then what you, for example, see is the so just to share that the first light gray bar is the 2014. That's our reference data scenario. And then the somewhat darker is the 2050 reference production for the baseline outcome. Well, most striking is, of course, because we put the CO2 taxes on there and we have the diet change on the meat consumption. You see that this primary livestock really decreases quite a bit in basically all scenarios. What you do see is that it's with the, so this is production volume in the EU. And you already see here that I have to, I hope you can read which of the scenarios is which, but the first one is this green EU close, where we protect also the market with this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then you see that there the impact on the livestock production is the lowest of all the scenario, which makes sense. Because you basically, in that scenario, you basically implement the protection of the EU market. Then the last one is this green world open scenario. This is where everybody has diet change and everybody has this food loss waste reduction. And there you see that the impact is biggest. And this is also partly because if only the EU does the greening measures, or if only the EU reduces their meat consumption, you see that the effect is not as strong, because we're still, it actually gives us more opportunity to export to the rest of the world. So actually we become a bit more competitive, which dampens this effect a little bit. One other observation is that you see that the agricultural land actually doesn't decrease that much. And it's because this we do add the additional protection, so that does a little bit. But it basically means a little bit that, especially in the grassland, we saw this in the Dutch results also very strong, that it more means that the production becomes more extensive. So you need to have this to make the most use of these kind of policies. You also need the policy that actually then perhaps puts some trees on where now the pastures are, if you want to go all the way, so to say. I won't say too much about this. So we have some results on the value added and things like that. So you simply see that the livestock, primary livestock sector just decreases quite a bit, which is of course not so strange. Then what is nice, I think, is these are the emissions. So these are the emissions from primary livestock. And you see that these increase radically. And this is also because we put in the CO2 tax, and we have this mechanism that makes it so that in principle, the farmers can implement technologies to reduce their methane emissions, for example, in this case. And you see that that's in all cases, it gives quite a strong reduction of the emissions from the livestock sector. Perhaps not as big as it should be for the real RCP 1.9 scenarios, for example, but we're not really targeting any certain emissions level. But it does give quite a strong reduction of the emissions without steering it directly. So this is really purely from this CO2 tax and the internal mechanism, plus the reduction of production, and then you end up at a level like this. So this is a slightly more complicated picture, but basically it's we did what is called a subtotals analysis, and I'm not sure how far in detail I should say this, but within the scenario runs that we do, we can determine the contribution of these elements that we implemented. So here you see the CO2 tax and diet change, food waste reduction, and see how much each of these factors that we implemented in the model, how much that affected, for example, the production change in the EU. And then here you see again, let's just as an example, focus on this primary livestock production here. So you see that in the reference, we see that the primary livestock increases by 12%. And in this, and just go to the most extreme one, in this green world open scenario, you see that it is reduced by 20%. And we can see from this analysis that that's actually mostly because of this diet change implementation that we did. And then secondly, and this is also interesting, if you look at the second largest contribution is actually the food waste reduction, because that actually decreases the general demand of things. And if you do that worldwide, then you see that the overall demand simply increases by that much. On the other hand, if you just do it for the EU, then it actually means, and this is just also a thing that I would definitely try to do better in the next run of an analysis like this. It basically means that the production in the EU becomes more efficient, and then the EU just starts to export a little bit more. And this is because this food waste implementation right now, we don't have any ideas of the cost associated with reducing the food waste. So it's basically like a free lunch, so to say, which I know we all don't believe exists in this group. But that's why you see here that the reduction of food waste actually increases livestock production, especially in this open EU-only scenario. You do see that if you, of course, and this also makes sense, if you look at the EU-only scenarios, then you see that this CO2 tax does have quite a strong contribution, because you're the only one that's doing that. If you do it on the whole world, the impact actually becomes a bit less, and that's something I'm still trying to figure out on the EU level, because I think it's because at the start data, the EU is already a little bit more efficient than the rest of the world. So then and we need to look at this MAC curve parameters as well to see if that makes sense a little bit, whether this is not, I find it unlikely that this is very realistic in this scenario.
Willem, you got 1 minute.
Okay. This is my penultimate slide, I think. So I'll be almost there. So I have a similar slide for this, for the emissions change, and then you see similar things, but then the other way around. But here you see that the CO2 tax is most efficient on getting the emissions down. And so in this kind of analysis, and in the paper we'll have a lot more details about this, but in this kind of analysis you can separate the contributions from all these different policy implementations. Oh, I lied. I've got one or two more, but it's fine. I'll skip this one. You can look it up later if you want to, but there's some GDP effects there. And actually what was funny for the, well, I won't skip it apparently. So what's funny for the Netherlands, this is left, this green open scenario was actually slightly positive for the GDP, whereas the effects worldwide are quite different. So it's also interesting to see where these policies have which effect. And then you also see that this is then the total GDP, and of course for the agriculture on itself, it's not positive, but for the total, it can actually have a slight positive effect. So quickly summarize. So you see animal production decrease is an important bit in this, and especially just only by doing CO2 tax and this diet change, you see that that's quite an impact. There is not really a runaway effect of agriculture that disappears. So you see that the existing land is used in a more extensive way. That's at least within the model results. And that's something that I want to also see if we can add some insights on that to see how much of the land could potentially be converted in some afforestation scenario. Perhaps there are some people that are looking into that as well, of course. I didn't go too much into detail on this compensating border tariff, but it is kind of interesting to look at that. You do indeed see that this protects the market, and this increases. It protects our agriculture, of course, but it does increase emissions a little bit compared to the other scenarios. And of course, for the global picture, and I didn't show the emission figures for the world as a whole, it's of course very clear that we do need to have this worldwide effort, because otherwise, if only the EU is doing some things, then of course we will never get there. Yeah, we have to start somewhere in Europe as well, of course. But it's clear that we need the rest of the world to tag along. That was my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, William. So the audience have any questions for William? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes,
Ernest.
thank you. Hi. I can't turn on the video. Apologies for that. A very interesting talk, and I was wondering what the food waste results in the subtotal analysis. I think it was slide 9. Okay, that is production change, and that. Okay, so here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Slide 9 was good.
Yeah.
And then in the bottom, in the total, oh, that's processed food. Yeah, so much to digest.
Sorry,
yeah. But no, fine. But I'm wondering, so that there is always there is a positive effect of that food waste shock in green EU, green open. I'm just wondering, why is that the case? Like, is that it must be an endogenous result, right? Of course, or is it driven by your assumptions?
No, so in principle, so the food waste is a very generic implementation that we do. So then it's I think it's like, perhaps if I make it a bit more concrete. So I said in the assumption that it's a reduction of 33% of current food waste levels. And according to the FAO report of a little while back already, the current food waste levels are 33%. So take a third of a third, and you have like a 10% improve of efficiency throughout the chain, so to say. And we implemented that in 3 parts in the chain, so at the production and consumption and the intermediate level. And basically what runs out, if you would keep everything different, that would reduce the production, because you simply are producing more efficient and you don't need as much even at the consumption level, right? So what happens if you just do that in the EU, but the rest of the world is still demanding all these products, then we actually become more competitive. And this is not really a very proper way of doing it, because you basically ignore all the costs that are involved. So that's why it's increasing the production in the end for the EU.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
But no, I can follow. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So and we were in the course of the project trying to see if we could put some value on it, so to say, to make it not so cheap to do. Because also somebody rightfully mentioned that if it would have been free, then it would have already been done, because then it would have been a very easy thing to do. But we couldn't really find, the cost associated with a policy like that. So that's why it isn't like this for now.
Thank you.
Right.
All right, good. Rafael, that's another question. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, William, for the presentation. More like a clarification on what maybe a technical detail on the trade preference shift that you simulate. How do you do this? Is Armstrong elasticity, or do you specifically assume that one region going through quantities? How essentially do you do it in the model? And perhaps another one on subsidies. Did you also touch subsidies on agriculture, or plan to include that in future analysis? Thanks, William.
Yeah, thanks. Very good questions. And I was afraid about the one of the trade preference shifter, because I didn't implement that myself. So I've been always a little bit fuzzy. It is really like a single parameter that basically within the point of the code where you have the substitution between the bundle of imports, so to say, that it then just forces that it is 20% higher than what it would have been, so to say. And it's really just, it's not something that we force specifically. So I don't have like one model run and then I calculate and then I force the trade. It's a parameter that basically steers within the substitution a little bit what happens. I can share the details later of the code. I will do it in the GTAP, but I'd have to look that up as well. Yeah, and about the subsidy, it is actually a great point, because I think in this trade tariffs, I reduce both subsidies and import tariffs. So I think it's also a reduction, and especially in the EU, you do see, and I think in the Netherlands it's even a little bit stronger, that even just reducing the subsidies is not in general a great thing, because then we get more competition from other regions when it comes to the meat imports and things like that. And that's what you definitely also see in this in these. You don't see it as much as I thought, perhaps, but if you zoom into specific sectors, you see that some sectors really react quite strong to that, and especially if you do the global opening, so to say, of the economy. And then here, yeah, this is with the adjustment mechanism. So you do see here in this green open, you see that it reduces actually the production, and this is because you remove the subsidies on the EU part as well.
Great, thanks, William.
All right.
Yeah, got another question. Go ahead, please. I'm having a hard time to correctly pronounce this name.
I'm curious as well.
It's Danish. It's Berge. I just had a question related to in your worldwide scenarios, you apply a uniform carbon tax, right, on every region?
Yes.
Is that correct? Yes. Have you looked into what that means in terms of the regional distribution of the emission reductions? Because I would think that, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I started talking before you finished your question, but
no, but
I think
just
that matters a lot.
Whether that breaks a little bit with sort of the climate agreement, sort of common but differentiated responsibilities. That the burden is higher on developing countries with higher emission intensities.
Yeah. So that's a great point, and that's something that I perhaps should put up more if I finish this into a paper, because it's not something that we looked in detail, and we know that it's not really in line with this burden sharing. And for example, what we saw is that this carbon tax, especially on the livestock sector, because we focus on that, of course, and you see that the emission, the relative emission intensity of the livestock sector in sub-Saharan Africa is relatively high, I guess, because they have a lot of grazers and things like that. And you see that especially there, it had actually quite a big impact, and we kind of ignored that a little bit, but it didn't seem to how to say, the balance was a little off. Let's let me say it a little bit like that. So and that's definitely something that we would like to have played with a little bit more, but because the original study was so much focused on the Dutch part, we didn't really have the time to do that yet. But that's a great point.
Thank you. It's very interesting research. So thank you for the presentation.
Thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So thank you, Willem, for the excellent presentation. So
thank you very much.
Yep. Let's move to our final speaker of the session. So Leona, yep. If you can start sharing your slides to see if you can share it and advance it, that'd be great.
Can you see?
Yeah, I can see it. We can see it. Would you mind make it a presentation mode or a full screen?
Presentation modes on the, but it shows it on the other screen. Maybe 1 second. Okay, I will remove the screen.
Okay, or you can probably move the bar, move your left-hand side panel a little smaller so people can see, in case you have small font in your later slides.
Seconds. I will just remove the screen, so I will remove one screen. I will do. Let me know if you can see that now.
Yeah, we can see it.
As in full screen.
Yep, that's good.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you very
Perfect.
much. Hi, my name is Eleonora Mavroeidi. I will present today our work on the policy scenarios for promoting the circularity of plastics. And this is work done together with my colleagues Ruben, Lisa, Martin, Rob, Daniel, and Jean. And some of them are today here. This presentation today will be organized as follows. I will start with some motivation, why we are interested into looking into policies for promoting circularity of plastics. I'll describe the modeling approach that we use for this analysis, so the model that we use and how we design the policy scenarios that we consider. Then present the main results of 2 policy scenarios that we discuss here, which is the regional action scenario and the global ambition scenario, and I will conclude with some main messages. So why are we interested in policies that would promote the circularity of plastics? Well, in the past decades, plastics use, including fibers and additives, have been growing continuously and have reached 460 megatons in 2019. Under our baseline assumptions, so in the absence of any new policies, we also project that the plastics use will almost triple by 2060 and reach 1,231 megatons. So the increased use of plastics will result in an increased plastic waste. And in the absence of any adequate waste management, that can lead to persistent plastic pollution. And plastic pollution will have adverse impacts on marine life, wildlife, livelihoods, and potentially human health. Thus, there's been an increased awareness towards the potential negative environmental effects of plastics pollution, and therefore initiatives, policy measures and initiatives have been taking place recently, including the UNA resolution, which ultimately looks into ending plastic pollution. And there's also been country-specific initiatives, such as, for example, the Osaka Blue Ocean Vision that was agreed among G20 leaders in 2019 and aims at reducing the additional leakage to the oceans to 0 by 2050. I would like to, there are 2 key aspects in what we are in the policy scenarios that we're considering. And in order to draw attention to that, I would like to show you what the flows of plastics throughout the plastics life cycle. and prompt your attention in two facts. So here we look at the plastics from the plastic production, waste, the leakages to the environment in red, and the amount of plastics that are being recycled in green. What is interesting is that based on our baseline projections, in the absence of any new policies, the amount of plastics, that waste that is going to be recycled into new plastics is expected to be approximately 14%. Therefore, the circularity of plastics is going to be relatively low, which means that there is space to increase the amount of plastics that can be recycled. The second point that is important is that in the baseline projections, we see that the leakages to the environment are expected to more than double. So this is the red parts in this flow chart. So with this in mind, we're going to discuss today different policy scenarios that will decrease the leakages, but at the same time increase the recycling of plastics. How do we do that? In our analysis, we provide a global assessment, currently looking at 15 different regions, and we have a time horizon to 2060. We using projections on demographics, labor, capital accumulation, and other factors of activity, we informed our macro model, the MV growth, which we use to get long-term projections, which then are used to calibrate our multi-sector CG model and the linkages. And this is the core of the analysis that we're going to be talking moving forward. So this model has been enhanced to include the plastics module, and then is being used to provide economic projections at the sector level, which then inform the projections of plastics that we're going to be discussing today. And these include plastics use, waste, and exposed plastic leakages. And I just want to highlight that we take into consideration the COVID-19. So for more information on our baseline projections, I think my colleague Ruben has already presented the results. In particular, when it comes to the plastics module, the plastics projections, we follow a 4-step process. So first, we use the MV leakages model which represent this complex dynamic of economic activities across sections and regions to derive regional and sectoral projections, which are the main drivers of the plastics use. Now, to project plastics use, we incorporated in the model plastics use data categorized by polymers and that are linked to the most relevant economic activities. And the projections of plastics use are based on the economic projections in the first step. Now, all plastics use will result in plastic waste. And therefore, using the linkages model, we project plastic waste based on plastics use, but also under the assumption that different products have different lifespans. And we also take into account international trade patterns, so trade within of waste, of plastics waste. The next step is that we also consider different end-of-life dates for this waste. So we consider 4 categories: recycled waste, incinerated, landfill, and also mismanaged waste. And the final step of our analysis focuses on looking at the environmental impacts of plastics use and waste. This is done ex post. So we use the outputs of our model and collaborated with the external consultants and experts in the field to derive the leakages of plastics to the environment. So using both leakages for macro and microplastics, as well as leakages to the aquatic environment. So with this setup, then we consider 2 policy scenarios that both of them are building on 3 pillars. The first pillar focuses on policies that restrain demand and enhance circularity, and includes fiscal instruments and eco-design measures and reuse. The second pillar focuses on policies that enhance recycling, and it includes policies that increase recycling rates, so improve waste management, recycling content targets, and extended producer responsibility schemes. And the third pillar focuses on closing the leakage pathways by introducing investments in waste collection and litter collection. So the two policy scenarios that we consider are the regional action and the global ambition scenario, and they're different in terms of the level of stringency. So the regional action has differentiated objectives for OECD and non-OECD economies, while the global ambition project presents coordinated efforts in order to reach the zero leakages, aquatic leakages. Let me give you a bit more detail of how we model what is included in each one of these three pillars that I mentioned earlier. So the first pillar, restrained demand and enhanced circularity, includes two instruments, fiscal instruments, and the first fiscal instruments, which are different, which in fact includes two sub-instruments: a tax on plastic packaging and a tax on all other types of plastics. And the level of tax is different among the two, with higher tax level for packaging and lower for all other types of plastics. So, for example, in the regional action scenario, we impose a tax on plastics that is increasing linearly from zero in 2021 and reached $1,000 per ton at different years for different countries. So by 2030 in the European Union, 2040 in the rest of the OECD, and 2060 in other non-OECD countries, and remains constant graph. And the tax on other plastics follows a similar pattern, but at a lower level, that is $750 per ton. And in the case of the global ambition scenario, then we assume that a uniform tax across all regions. So across all regions. So the second instrument included in this pillar includes policies that increase the circularity and encourage more durable and repairable design of plastics. The way we model this is including three sub-instruments. So first, an extension of the product lifespans, which is coupled with a decrease in the intermediary and final demand for durables. So it's just to reflect that these longer lifespans of products, and also an increase in the demand for services, which is calibrated such as the overall household and government expenditures are unaffected by the policy. So these policies are applied globally in both scenarios, and they're different across the regional and global action ambition scenario by the amount of extension in product lifespans. The second pillar, enhanced recycling, includes three instruments. The first one is the recycled content targets, which are modeled through a tax on primary plastics, combined with a subsidy on secondary plastics. And I think that this provides a proxy for the regulation to achieve the targeted share of secondary in the total production of plastics. And differentiation across the two scenarios is that in the regional action, the non-OECD countries are having half of the target than the OECD countries, which is the target of the OECD countries is 40%, so they are less ambitious. The second instrument included in this pillar is including region-specific recycling rate targets. And this has been informed looking at the recycling targets, country-specific recycling targets that are also considered to be feasible. And the differentiation among the two scenarios is has to do with the ambition, primarily the ambition level of these targets, but also primarily an increased ambition in non-OECD countries. Just want to highlight that we associate investment costs, so it's not free to increase recycling. And the final instrument in this pillar is the extended producer responsibility, which are implemented for sectors, for specific sectors, for packaging, electronics, motor vehicles, and clothing. And the difference between the two scenarios is that in the regional action, the EPR is only implemented in OECD and non-OECD EU countries, while the global ambition has a global coverage. Let me give you a bit more detail of how we model the EPR. So EPR includes, it's modeled by looking at 4 different things. So the increase in production cost is captured by a tax on plastics inputs for the affected sectors. Then the increase in the waste collected for recycling is proxied by a subsidy on waste sector, which includes recycling. And this is done so that the EPR overall is budget neutral. Also, EPR has been seen to increase recycling rates. So we implement an increase in recycling rates that reflects the policy targets recycling in particular rather than all waste management. And this has been, the calibration has been informed based on EU studies. And finally, that we take into account the associated investment costs in recycling facilities and collection for recycling to amount for this increase in recycling rates. So the third pillar focuses on closing the leakage pathways and includes public investment in waste collection and sanitary landfills. And here the differentiation between the two scenarios is that in the regional action scenario, the target is that OECD countries eliminate or collected mismanaged waste by 2060 and non-OECD countries halve their share of mismanaged waste, while in the global ambition, all countries eliminate the mismanagement of all collected waste by 2060. And the final instrument in this pillar is involves policies that improve litter collection. So based on literature, we think there is a collection of litter is associated with income. So under the baseline scenario, in high-income countries, 85% of litter is being collected. So in the regional action scenario, we assume that the litter collection rates increase and reach 90% for high-income countries, and there's no change for the collection rates for low-income countries. While in global ambition, in addition, we assume that collection rates for low-income countries increase from 65% in the baseline to 75%. So these 3 pillars are, so with the rest of the remaining of the analysis, we implement these pillars additively, so one after the other. So we'll be showing the cumulative effects of this instrument. So what do our results show? So the regional action scenario, so we will substantially decrease plastics use, which is projected to decrease by 18% compared to baseline in 2060, followed by a similar decrease in plastics waste. And I would like to note here that what drives the decrease in plastics waste is there are 2 mechanisms that drive the decrease in plastics waste. First, the reduction in plastics use, but second, the prolongation of the lifespans of food. So there is going to be a delay of waste generation. So overall, the effect would have been smaller if the second part wasn't there. And with decreased plastics waste and improved waste management, there will be a decrease in mismanaged waste of 63%, reaching 59 megatons in 2060. Mismanaged waste is the main source of leakages to the environment. So the main source of microplastics, and microplastics the main source of leakages to the environment. Therefore, they would lead to the decrease in the leakages to the environment, which amounts to 55% compared to base. Now, from the leakages to the environment from mismanaged waste would also contribute to the leakages to the aquatic environments, which will decrease by 60% compared to baseline in 2016.
Eleonora, you got 2 minutes.
Yeah, so the regional action scenario, so what I would like to show here is that the different pillars contribute to the decrease in plastics waste, plastic leakages. So the first pillar plays a key role in reducing plastics use. But the other two pillars has recycling closed leakage pathways improve in addition plastics waste management, and therefore highly contribute in the decrease in mismanaged waste, which therefore translates in similar reductions in plastic leakages. Similarly, I will go fast now and I will remove that. So I want to say that the ambition of the global action scenario is even higher. And what I would like you to focus on is that the leakages to the aquatic environments are almost eliminated. And the only leakages that remain are the ones that cannot be collected. So waste that cannot be collected, like microplastics. And similarly, the contributions of the different pillars as in the previous are similar as in the regional action scenario, but in higher percentages. So the other important thing of these scenarios is that they do a good job in reducing plastic leakages, but also increase the share of recycled plastics, which is increase the share of recycled plastics compared to total plastics used. So we see that the market share of recycled plastics increases from 12% in the baseline to almost 30% in the regional action, 40% in the global ambition. However, despite all these positive impacts, the plastics used in waste are still projected to more than double from 2019 levels under the regional action scenario. So just so the main message is that one message to take is that action helps reducing leakages, but plastics use still and waste still increase despite that. And this effect comes at the cost of these policy scenarios is relatively small, so it's less than 1% of global GDP. And in particular, I would like you to see the green line. So the green line here is the global effect of the global ambition scenario, and the dotted line is the effect of the regional ambition scenario. So this is 0.3% of GDP, and this is about 0.8% of GDP. And there are different factors that contribute to this small GDP effect. One of them being the fact that, for instance, fiscal instruments generate a cost, but also generate revenues. They're being used to fund waste management investments, which can also generate value added. Or that, for example, EPR schemes can generate a cost for producers, but also generate revenues for waste management. And overall, the effect of non-OECD countries is higher than in OECD countries of the global ambition scenario. So just to conclude, so we provide information. So we design these comprehensive policy scenarios that are different in terms of stringency. And what we see is that in order to reduce the leakage to the environment, we need a broad range of policies, and we can achieve that at a relatively reasonable cost. However, plastics are still an essential part of our economy, and even under these scenarios, plastics use and waste will keep increasing. So by combining all these different policies that darken the life cycle, the different life cycle stages can reduce the plastic leakage to the environment, but in the interim, there will be an accumulation of stocks of plastics, which will continue to grow. So even under the most ambitious scenario, we project that the accumulated stocks of plastics in the aquatic environments will reach 300 megatons in 2060, which is slightly more than double of the current values in 2019. Therefore, perhaps we could consider additional measures to clean up the remaining plastic leakage, and also in order to remove all this marine plastics pollution. And yeah, I would like to say the next steps would be to also do more of a regional focus and focus on the Asian and EU regions. And with that, I would like to conclude and also invite you to, if you want more details on our report, there will be a launch on the 21st of June, and please feel free to register. And welcome any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting topic and great presentation. I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience. I probably will ask while we were waiting. So,
I actually have a question, but yeah,
go ahead.
Maybe it's slightly off topic, not really off topic, but I was wondering in terms of, you know, like this is, you looked at circularity of plastics and recycling. I'm always wondering about incineration of plastics as a, let's say, second best solution, especially in countries where electricity production is, where there's a shortage of electricity production and where recycling maybe has a lot of challenges. Is it something that is being discussed or that you have maybe thought of doing, or am I missing a very important point that why this maybe is not of relevance? Thanks.
No, it's certainly of relevance. So in our alliances, we consider, as I said, different types of end-of-life aids, and incineration is one of them. What we see in our results is that by increasing the recycling rates, we actually so there are two factors. One is by increasing the recycling of plastics, then that would mean that there is less waste to be managed, and so there is more percentage of share of waste that is being incinerated. But in volumes, actually that increases. So increasing incineration is something that in volumes will take place. At the same time, we see an increase in landfilling. So these two factors are the ones that are going to affect how the waste is being managed in the future. But we do not consider a policy where we say explicitly a country should prefer to incinerate as opposed to recycling.
Okay. Yeah.
It's indirectly, it's happening through the residuals.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. Other questions? So Eleonora, you talked about the COVID impact at the beginning. I'm wondering how that is kind of passed through the system when you consider those plastic policies.
Sorry, I missed the first part.
Oh, I said you mentioned the COVID at the beginning. So I'm wondering how that is blended in the whole system. So you are implementing the tax.
So COVID has a short-term negative GDP effect, and we consider the different recoveries in GDP. So different recovery patterns, and that affects plastic. We see that it affects plastics use marginally, and it doesn't have a long-term effect, a big long-term effect.
Okay, the short term.
But for instance, in the short term, we see an increase in the use of single-use plastics, in particular plastics for medical uses.
I see. Interesting.
But there is also a decrease in plastics use overall, so the overall effect of plastic waste is small.
Thanks. Rafael, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Eleonora, for the presentation. It's really comprehensive in terms of policies, and I'm really impressed by that. I think you covered a large amount of different areas there. Congrats for that. My comment is more on maybe on the other side, on the firm level and companies level side. If there are any I mean, I've seen the presentation from Ruben, your colleague, yesterday, and I saw that, that you have the disaggregation of different types of plastics and so on. And I was wondering about if at the firm level, these companies are already sort of anticipating some the direction of these policies to in terms of reducing the use of plastic, let's say in packaging or any other areas. So it will be more like a comment on the other side of the story, not on the policy side, but on the at firm level side. If you have any impressions on that, if you could share, that would be great. Thanks, and thanks for the presentation.
Thank you. So the analysis is not at the firm level; it's done on the sectoral level, and also it's not forward-looking in the sense that by design, SCG. So a firm today cannot anticipate that tomorrow's prices of plastic will be higher. But at any point in time, they see a higher price in plastics, and they will adjust their production and demand patterns, demand for intermediate goods patterns based on that. So in that sense, that contemporaneously, if we take a firm as being represented by a sector, they will adjust based on the changes in price.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, quick follow-up, but probably not another specific. Of course, in the modeling, it's clear. Thanks for that. But outside the modeling, on the real, let's say, real world, where firms are, two firms are pushing harder to reduce plastic. Maybe that's the question that I wanted to ask. Do you see that initiatives already coming from the supply side, let's say?
I'm afraid I won't have an expert answer on this, but
Okay.
I suspect that that they're different in different sense. There is not a clear-cut answer to that because, for instance, motor vehicles would be very difficult to replace plastics, but in other sectors there might be equally good or equally economically competitive substitutes, and they can use paper, they can use metals. So I think it varies based on the sector, and also in the country where a company lies on, depending on the domestic resources.
Yeah, I'm wondering the technology, so how fast it can move forward to be able to provide low cost substitutes for the plastics. So I think that when you have some very cheap replacement substitutes, probably it's quickly effective to crowd out the plastic products because consumers will vote. So they will use cheaper and more decomposable materials if that is available. So it's also depending on the sectoral level investment in the new technology, and probably with some public support from the government. Yeah.
In addition, also investments in our technology for recycling. So making sure, like improving the sorting of polymers, and so having clear plastics, and improving also how we recycle them and reducing the downcycling. So there's a lot of space for improvements in technology.
Very interesting topic. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And so I would like to thank all our presenters for this session. We have enjoyed your talks, and then I thank also for the audience active participation to our session. And I hope many of you can still attend our final planetary discussion of the conference. And yeah, thank you for your participation, and I look forward to see you in the future conferences.